I suppose today's event, today's workshop on EU enlargement comes at a very appropriate time for Europe, for the European Union. Today, in Brussels, the European Union signed, I suppose questionably signed, an association agreement with the Ukraine. And of course the association agreement, the attempts to sign the agreement much earlier has, caused significant problems for the Ukraine vis-a-vis their relationship with Russia. The shift closer to Europe, bringing Europe to Russia's back door, has proved quite problematic, as we have seen. And again, I think today with the signing of the association agreement by the interim government in the Ukraine, I think perhaps again this might further inflame relations rather than calm tensions between Russia and the European Union. And arguably, I think the interim Ukrainian government should have waited until the elections were held in May, and then for more of a legitimate government to decide whether or not they wanted to proceed with an association agreement. So the European Union and the process of EU enlargement that's going to form the basis of my talk today is very much in flux. It is very much it's very much a process of continuity. Every decade since the European Union was founded in the 1950s, from the 60s onwards, EU enlargement has been on the political agenda. Every decade since the 1970s, you've had an enlargement take place. There was one in the 70s, the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and the most recent one was Croatia last year, where they became the 28th member of the European Union. So the way I'm going to structure my talk today is, I suppose in many ways, help to explain how and why, with more of an emphasis on the why, EU enlargement has taken place. Why has the European Union decided to open its doors? That's one question. Why did it go from 6 to 28? And then added to this, then why do non-member states, why do countries outside want to join the European Union? What are the reasons behind it? Is it because they all feel this unique sense of Europeanness, that they all buy into the ideals and aspirations that created it? Is it for security reasons, geopolitical reasons? Is it for the money? The massive sheer volumes of money, pots of cash that come with joining the European Union. So access to cohesion funds, structural funds, common agricultural policy funds, and really all of the rest of the money that is provided to new member states. So there's a wide variety of reasons why countries would want to join the European Union, and there's a lot of reasons why the European Union would open its doors. So these are kind of some of the things I will be touching upon. I suppose for clarity, and I know the United States and Americans love acronyms, I'm not a fan of them myself, although the European Union has got a fair amount of them themselves, but I will be using the term European Union to mean, I understand of course the European Union only came into existence after the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. Prior to that it was referred to as the European Community, and prior to that again it was the European Economic Community, but for simplistic reasons, I will just refer to it as the European Union, and that will imply the process that starts in 1958. So I will go through the enlargements and analyze some of them in some great detail, but the structure of the workshop really rests on explaining, as I said, why the origins and development of the enlargement policy. Then dealing with some of the more fascinating enlargements, I will cover all of them, but some in more detail than in others. The fourth enlargement with the Austrians, the Swedes, and the Finns wasn't as exciting or as sexy as the first enlargement with the British, or the 2004 enlargement with Central and Eastern European countries. So, or even bringing in Spain and Portugal was somewhat interesting, but not necessarily as fascinating or as politically mischievous as the Greek accession in 1981. And then in my conclusions I will go back again to discuss some of the more interesting case studies, Britain being one of the more interesting ones. Britain, as I will discuss in the talk, has pursued a relatively erratic European policy, not only in the pre-membership days, but particularly in the post-membership days. And David Cameron, the current British Prime Minister, announced last January that he would hold a referendum, January 2013, that he would hold a referendum in midway through the next British Parliament in 2017, a referendum on whether Britain should remain in the European Union, provided, of course, he gets re-elected next year. So I will discuss the British problem, and then I will also focus on some of the more other, I suppose, interesting enlargements that are on the agenda. Some of those countries are in the waiting room, Turkey, Serbia, and so on, and the prospects for their membership. And this is one of the key questions that we have to ask ourselves is, how far do we go? How wide does the European Union go before it stops enlarging? So if we bring in Turkey, do we bring in Iraq? Do we bring in Israel? If we look at that fascinating cultural spectacle every year that we call the Eurovision Song Contest, that includes Azerbaijan. It includes a whole range of countries that are not necessarily usually considered to be European. So how far do we go? And I often make the comparison with the United States. America stopped expanding at one stage as well, right? So arguably the United States or the European Union may well stop at, say, 30 or 31, and that'll be it, and then they will have kind of association agreements with other countries. But that's where my comparison will stop. I don't believe that there is that many solid comparisons that can be made between, in explaining the European Union or explaining policies of it, that can be explained using the US-EU comparison or US-EU model. The European Union is not a federal system. It is not. We have things that look like what the United States has, but it is not similar. So I will refrain from using examples here in the United States. How do we explain enlargement? Well, enlargement policy is not easily explained. The Economist magazine a number of years ago referred to enlargement policy as by far the most successful policy that the European Union has ever promoted. Beyond agriculture, beyond competition, beyond all the other policy tools and instruments that they have, enlargement policy has been the most successful. Notwithstanding the problems that we have in the European Union with some of the member states, southern member states, western member states, in our northern member states in terms of fiscal economic problems or the rise of Euroscepticism and the rise of the far right in the Netherlands and Finland and Britain, economic problems in some of the southern countries, southern Mediterranean countries, but not just them. The Belgians also have mountains of debt, as do the French. So notwithstanding the problems that we have within these countries, the argument can very easily be made that it has been a positive experience bringing these countries into the European Union, largely from their own national perspectives. And we have, of course, had post-membership problems and post-membership dramas in many of these countries, where then people make the argument, well, perhaps we should have just waited a number of years before we allowed them in. But nevertheless, you do see EU enlargement has true norms and values and promotion of certain, the rule of law and freedom of press has helped to strengthen the democracies and the administrations and the bureaucracies of some of these countries who joined after 1973. Going back to the very beginning of this whole process, the founding fathers of the European Union, those who were active in the 1950s putting together the Treaty of Rome, firmly believed that it would never just remain a club of six, northern, rich, industrial, soon to be relatively industrialized again after the war, 6 northern industrialized countries. So within the Treaty of Rome, they had made provision under Article 237, which said any country may join the European Economic Community. So that clause was there. Article 238 then provided for associate membership. And associate membership then really was a form of membership without the full benefits. You would not have a vote in the Council of Ministers. You would not have a seat at certain institutions. In the Commission, for example, you would be an associate of it. You would get access to certain parts of the customs union, the single market later on. You would get certain funding opportunities and so on. So Greece and Turkey were two of the first member states, or two of the first European countries to get associate membership in the late 50s, early 60s. So the policy framework, the legal framework to expand the then EEC, the present day EU, was already there from day one in the Treaty of Rome. So when the European Union, or the EEC was back then, when it started business on the 1st of January 1958, there was already talk about, you know, countries joining, and there was a, you know, that discourse, that debate had already started because the policy instruments were in place to provide for it. I will get, throughout my talk, when I'm discussing certain European countries and the reasons for their own accession to the EEC, the EU, I will explain, you know, individually their own reasons for wanting to join. But in many ways, I suppose you could maybe kind of condense two issues that kind of can fit many of the countries, but not necessarily all of them. And policy and institutional frameworks within the European Union certainly appealed to some of the smaller member states. After you join the European Union, you've got a seat. You can appoint someone to the European Commission. You've got, well, in theory at least, an equal voice around the Council of Ministers table and at the European Council. Malta has a veto. Ireland has a veto over enlargement. So Malta, a country of a few 100,000 people, could say, you know what, we don't want Turkey in the European Union. We will exercise our right to veto. An EU enlargement policy is one of the last remaining, albeit very important, policy fields where each member state has a veto. It is not it's not a qualified majority voting process. Each country can veto further expansion. But many member states, or many prospective member states, those on the outside looking in during the 60s, 70s, 80s and so on, saw certain policy fields, whether it was agricultural policy or regional policy, and they thought, you know, we would love to be involved in that. On the agricultural side, you have many non-member states who have got big agricultural communities, and to get access to the common agricultural policy would be a major economic boost. And that applies to many of the countries. A lot of Central Eastern European countries. It applied to Ireland, who looked on very enviously during the 1960s as French farmers were getting guaranteed prices for all their produce. So the common agricultural policy was overly generous. So if you're a French farmer producing copious amounts of wine, you're getting a fixed price for that produce. You don't worry about market prices. The common agricultural policy provided for fixed prices. So you could, and there was no quotas, so you could produce as much as you wanted, despite the massive amounts that was overproduced, and you would get a fixed price under the cap. That's a pretty sweet deal, right? No quotas and a fixed price. So of course you have Irish farmers, and of course Ireland is relatively agrarian by the 1960s still. Agriculture dominates industrial production, although it does balance out later in the 1960s. But nevertheless, Irish farmers are thinking, you know, we've got to get in quickly to benefit from this. The British are looking at this from a different perspective. They're like, well, we've got to get in there quickly to water down the common agricultural policy, because Britain would not benefit from the cap. They have a lot less farmers, far more industrial. They have a few farmers that are huge farmers, have thousands of acres of land. So they would benefit, but it's negligible, the British benefits from the common agricultural policy. So the British were like, well, we would like to get in there sooner rather than later in order to make sure that the European community, the EU, does not go too far in a particular direction, too far that we can't bring it back. Okay? So some countries really, the institutional and the policy framework are really appealed to them. For others then, it was about leadership. Leadership in Europe. The Americans had been saying to the British for a very long time, prior to entry in 73, that, you know, you've got to get in there. We need a counterbalance to French hegemony within the European community. That proved difficult, of course. It wasn't as if they could just walk in. You know, they had to be allowed in by the 6 member states. But nevertheless, using the European Union as a vehicle to improve your own standing in the world, or to reassert your own standing after, of course, you've lost your empire, Europe can be now seen as a new kind of a tool to exert more influence. The French used it quite cleverly during the 60s. So leadership in Europe, of course, is attractive. Poland, for example, has often considered itself, at least, to be the heir to Britain. Britain never really applied itself and exercised the influence it could have had in the European Union. And many Poles would see themselves as being now the counterweight. So you've got France, Germany, and Poland, rather than France, Germany, and Britain. And Poland is quite eager to wait in the wings and take over that mantle of that tripartite, rather than because, you know, clearly Britain is moving, would appear to be moving closer and closer towards the exit. So enlargement policy is not wholly, it's not straightforward. There's no one-size approach fits all in terms of understanding why all of these countries, why these 22 countries that joined after 1973, explaining why they joined and the reasons for their membership is largely, you have to kind of tailor the approach to meet each example. By far, for me, I think the first enlargement was the most complicated, was, I think, the most political, at least the most politically fraught enlargement that has taken place. I remember last year in Washington, we had an event at the Wilson Center on the Serbia-Kosovo agreement that had been signed in April of last year. And I remember talking to some Serbians who were really kind of annoyed that it's going to take so long to join the European Union. You know, people in Belgrade are saying, it's going to take 10 years, we're going to lose interest. How do we keep them motivated? And I had to remind them, and I was like, you know, it took Britain, Ireland and Denmark almost 13 years to get in, from the first application in 1971 to finally getting inside the door in 1973. Most Central and Eastern European countries applied in the early 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They didn't get in until 2004. Turkey has been looking to get in for like almost an eternity, right? So one needs to put these things in kind of some kind of historical perspective. And what I would say, what I've often said to the Serbs is that use the time wisely, right? Post-membership, you know, is a different environment. You have to apply all of the rules and regulations associated with membership. And those rules include no more state aid to industry, right? The government can't prop up failing industries. I know the Italians have a terrible habit of giving money to Alitalia, which of course is in breach of EU competition law, but state aid to industry is illegal in the European Union. Increasing and improving your bureaucracies. All of these things need to be done before you join, rather than having the headache of dealing with them after. So there are lots of opportunities, and one needs to see this as an opportunity, the period prior to membership, and using that time wisely. In the late 1950s, after the European Community was created in 1958, or at least from whence they started, you know, when the institutions were up and running and they had started the process of implementing various aspects of the Treaty of Rome, the British had tried to throw a spanner into the works by proposing in 1958 or 56 an alternative to the EEC. Rather than going down this road of having a customs union, a very closed shop of 6 countries with a tariff barrier to any goods entering the EEC, the British proposed in 1956 the creation of a free trade area. And the free trade area would be a much wider organisation. There would be no supranational institutions, for example. The FTA would be composed of all of those countries within the OEEC, the Organisation for European Economic Cooperation. The predecessor, or the successor organisation, is the OECD in Paris today. But there was about 21, I think, member states of the OEC, and Britain was like, well, why don't we have a free trade area with all of those countries? We just trade, no barriers to trade, but no supranational institutions. And between 56 and 58, there was actually negotiations in Paris on this idea. De Gaulle came back to power from his self-imposed exile in 1958. And de Gaulle, who was no lover of supranational institutions, hated the idea of another authority having more power over national governments. But there were certain policy instruments that were part of the Treaty of Rome, particularly the Common Agricultural Policy, which would massively benefit French farmers. French farmers were the backbone of Gaullist support. So, rather than destroying or just, getting rid of the EEC, he embraced it for various reasons in 58 when he came back to power. He decided to pull out of the FTA talks, and the FTA talks collapsed in 1958. The European Six, the 6 member states, France, Italy, the Benelux countries, and West Germany proceeded to create and continue with the EEC model. Not content, the British decided then to create an alternative economic bloc, namely the European Free Trade Association, founded in 1959. And that was largely composed of, well, Britain, Scandinavian countries, and oddly enough, Portugal, I think, invited themselves to join at one stage, but, largely Scandinavian countries and Britain. What was distinct between the two economic blocs, so that by 1959, Europe was now divided into 6s and 7s. EEC, EFTA. And what was different from the EFTA was they had no agricultural policy. Right? There was no alternative, there was no equivalent to a cap. It was simply a free trade area in a range of goods, but cap was not a key component. So then by 1960, Europe is divided between 6s and 7s. So you have got kind of this, I wouldn't say a trade war or an economic war or two competing blocs, because largely the EFTA was meaningless. It was in comparison to where the EEC was going. Walter Hallstein, the first president of the European Commission, there's lots of great stuff in the archive about him, rubbishing the EFTA. It's like, they built a ship, but, there's no crew to man it, or, they'll never get it. It's going to hit the rocks and it's just going to be a disaster. And, he was incredibly proud of what they had created with the EEC. So, you have this, Britain is in this other economic bloc by 1960, and certainly there is a growing impression among some officials in Brussels that the EFTA is simply an attempt by the British, another attempt by the British to destroy the EEC. And you've got some very pro-Europeans, of course, who are putting a lot of effort and a lot of time and commitment and energy into this kind of utopian concept that the EEC is the forerunner to the United States of Europe. And they see Britain as trying to, in some way, sabotage that by creating alternatives, but not embracing or not joining the EEC. And then Britain is I think, is one of my favourite examples of within the enlargement policy. I'm working on a book at the moment that looks at Britain and the European Union from Edward Heath in the 1970s to David Cameron today, and looking at this very erratic relationship. But my research question really is whether we're talking about separation or divorce. Unhappy couples generally don't stay together. They find some kind of an arrangement, whether it is a separation or a divorce. But unhappy couples don't stay together. Notwithstanding, the British EU marriage turned 40 last year, and 40 years together is not an insignificant time period. But nevertheless, it seems to be that they are trying to constantly redefine their relationship. But the British relationship with Europe has been quite problematic, largely because of their history, weighed down by the idea and the notion of empire. Churchill said in 1930 that we are with Europe but not of it. We are linked but not compromised. We are interested and associated but not absorbed. We belong to no single continent but to all. And in 1930, of course, that is true. Okay? The only country that had kind of broken away from that was Ireland, at least the Republic of Ireland got away. But again, the idea of end of empire, disintegration, decolonization, all of this really does not factor into the British mindset. And, Churchill, of course, would have been uniquely aware of the attempts during the 1920s with the Pan-Europa movement at creating more of a united European state. So, he would be very conscious of these ideas floating around Europe on closer integration and cooperation. Fast forward then to 1960, and his successor, Harold Macmillan, on a trip to South Africa, makes as many consider to be one of his more important speeches, the Wind of Change speech, where he talks about the wind of change is blowing through this continent, which the continent he's referring to as Africa, and whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact. We must all accept it as a fact, and our national policies must take account of it. And he's talking, the wind of change, again, is this process of decolonization, which of course is in full swing by 1960. Britain is reassessing its own place in the world. And the Wind of Change speech, in many ways, is kind of the first direct reference by a sitting British Prime Minister to the fact that the empire has disintegrated. It has collapsed. I mean, if any of you have read some of the great novels by Doris Lessing or Rumer Godden or Nadine Gordimer, where their novels talk about the decline of empire through their female protagonists. And it really is fascinating that, throughout the 50s and 60s, you have this growing genre of literature, fascinating material, really discussing the collapse of empire, and Britain itself then is trying to refocus its attention as to what role does it play now in this new world. It can no longer be considered to be a global policeman. It's not a superpower. We live in a bipolar world with the Americans and the Soviets in 1960. So, what does Britain do? Where does it go? What role does it play? Where does it see itself? And there's some very interesting material in London and also here in the United States, archival material, where you see a lot of pressure from the Americans, Kennedy's administration, the Eisenhower administration, the Kennedy administration, prompting Britain, pushing Britain closer and closer and closer to consider membership of the EEC, largely as a counterweight. I mean, the Americans do see, well, Britain is no longer a world policeman, right? Your place really is in Europe. You just got to embrace it and accept it and get on with it. But you can provide leadership. Because, of course, Franco-American relations are not that good. I mean, de Gaulle and Kennedy, de Gaulle's attitude is, well, why should I go to Washington? Why doesn't the American president come to Paris? I'm also a president. And de Gaulle also wants a nuclear deterrent. Something the Americans have, but he doesn't have. Now, he does work towards that, and by the end of the 1960s, France has its own nuclear deterrent. France looks at the EEC as a way of gaining prestige for France and inserting leadership within Europe. Because, of course, Britain doesn't really know where it is at the moment, and Germany is in no position to assert anything other than just simply paying into the EEC budget. So France develops a role for itself, a meaningful role as an economic power, as a growing hegemonic power in the EEC, but of course it's still lacking what all superpowers need, which is a nuclear deterrent. Nevertheless, there is a shift, a gradual shift between 1959 and 1960 in London towards considering membership of the European Economic Community. So it's a massive turnaround from where they were in 1958, creating the EFTA, wanting a wider, looser trade agreement, and in many ways, London believing that the EEC would never work, okay? Because Britain had been invited to join the negotiations on the Treaty of Rome in Messina and elsewhere, but the attitude in London was, it's never going to work, they're never going to agree, it will not be a success. And very quickly, of course, you see very committed Europeans within the EEC rapidly accelerating plans to implement the Treaty of Rome. So it does become quite successful very, very quickly. And Britain sees this. Not only Britain, but many other countries as well. The Danes, the Irish, and so on, the Norwegians. So you have this then, the tension is kind of slowly building. Will they, won't they make an application to join the EEC? Wolfram Kaiser, the historian the historian of many, he's an expert on a great many areas of interest, of research on Europe. But he wrote, the title of his, I think one of his first books was Britain and the or Using Europe, Abusing the Europeans, Britain and the EEC. And he talks about, you know, or at least he raises the question whether Britain could go from, you know, laggard to leader of an enhanced core Europe. So from the bold boy outside, you know, casting doubt on and trying to even, you know, hope and wish for the disintegration of the EEC, perhaps post-membership that they would go on to lead this organisation. And there are countries within the EEC, within those 6, who are actually looking for British leadership as an alternative to French hegemony. The Dutch, for example, would love the British to join the EEC. Because, you know, they're a huge export market, more opportunities, and this kind of liberal economic idea is something that they're very keen on. So, by early 1961, lots and lots and lots of rumour and counter-rumour that Britain will move closer towards the EEC. And in August 1961, Britain makes an application for membership. Harold Macmillan is the Prime Minister, so you have the Conservatives decide to make an application. And the Conservatives in London, the Conservative Party, are far from united on the subject. But nevertheless, there's a lot of pressure from various angles, particularly from the Americans. Kennedy and Macmillan are quite close. They have a close personal relationship, and there is pressure. You see a lot of the Fruce papers, the foreign policy of the United States papers, where you do see a huge amount of cabling between the Americans and the Europeans talking about, or the Americans and the British talking about moving closer and closer to Europe and applying for membership. Negotiations then quickly begin. September 1961, enlargement negotiations open. Unlike today, where we have in the European Union very clear guidelines or chapters or criteria for EU membership. Back in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, there was really no criteria for membership. We have no enlargement policy, okay? You know, are you democratic? Yes. Do you believe in the rule of law? Yeah, we're okay. Have you democratic institutions? Okay, you're good to go, right? Of course, de Gaulle would have loved to have brought Spain into the EEC much sooner, but people kind of pointed out to him, well, Franco's kind of a problem, right? It is a dictatorship. De Gaulle would have seen as well, I'm a general, he's a general, you know. So there were certain kind of very loose criteria. A lot of it was negotiated during the enlargement negotiations. Economic details, you know, adopting EU legislation, all these kinds of things. That was done during the negotiations. There was no pre-accession period where you had to implement X, Y, and Z rules and criteria like you have today, right? That only came in the 1990s. Prior to that, you really have kind of a very political integration, a very political enlargement. The negotiations are very complex, okay? I won't go into bore you with the details. Some of the literature I provided, one of the chapters in my own book, but also Piers Ludlow has done a lot on the first enlargement, particularly on the British negotiations. Britain comes to the table with a huge amount of baggage. Okay. One of the chapters in my book, I when I was researching Britain's first application, the range of issues was simply phenomenal. And the detail was so minute. I mean, they were talking about the price of kangaroo meat from Australia, how that impact on, exports into the EEC, every little commodity had to be negotiated commodity for commodity for commodity, right? And of course, negotiations get bogged down, right? It takes forever then to get to this. So between September 1961 and the summer of 1962, you have got, there's no meaningless negotiations going. There's all these silly negotiations on things like kangaroo meat. I mean, Jean Monnet is saying, kind of pulling his hair out and saying to the British, just sign the accession treaty. Accept it all and sign it and negotiate afterwards. Okay? Why are you getting bogged down in trying to accommodate sectoral interests in New Zealand, in Australia, in Canada? Those white old dominions will look after themselves. Okay? Just sign the accession treaty. Of course, the New Zealanders and the Canadians and the Australians viewed things slightly different. They were like, well, they were saying to London, you can't sell us out here. You have to protect our interests. If you go into the EEC, there's a customs barrier, a tariff barrier. All of our exports to you via the EEC, we have to pay huge duties on these now. So you go in there and negotiate a special treatment for us. Edward Heath, of course, who in 1961 is leading the negotiations for Britain. He's the Minister for European Affairs. So he's put in charge. Interestingly, that he is the minister in charge of the 1961 negotiations, and he's the Prime Minister who takes Britain in a decade later. So Heath and his team are trying to negotiate all these interests. They're trying to negotiate Britain's particular interests as a country with the EEC, and then they're negotiating half their empire who want who want access as well. So it becomes very complicated. But by the summer of 1962, I have argued, although others would argue that the end of the negotiations came later, but I argue that by August 1962, there's a growing sense amongst the British diplomats and others that this is going nowhere. We're not, negotiations are dead at this stage, right? And they kind of drag on. There's no meaningless. Some people are saying de Gaulle is just doing this. He's dragging these things out because you know what? He doesn't want them to join anyway. He doesn't want Britain to join. He wants to drag them out so long that the British will get so bored and they will walk away from the table. So I've argued that the negotiations really ended in the summer, late summer of 1962. Towards the end of 1962, then Macmillan and Kennedy meet in the Bahamas for a meeting at Nassau, where they sign an agreement on Polaris missiles. Okay, the British will get Polaris missiles from the Americans. Some would say that was kind of not a strategic thing to do when you're in the middle of an enlargement negotiation with the French, who of course don't have a nuclear deterrent but want one. And here you see this cozy nuclear relationship between the Americans and the British. And of course the Americans won't tell the French how to make their own nuclear bomb. They won't give them the material or the information, the knowledge to do this. So on the 14th of January 1963, de Gaulle gives one of his twice annual press conferences. De Gaulle's press conferences are meticulously planned, down to the last cup of water, right? And they're usually big affairs. So in 1961 or 1963, you would have had maybe 1,000 journalists cover de Gaulle's press conferences at the Elysee. On the 14th of January 1963, de Gaulle decides that Britain is not going to join the EEC. Some will say, okay, there is a link between a Nassau agreement between the Americans and the British. Others will say, well, actually, he's just using this as an excuse to keep them out and not wanting to share hegemony or power with Britain. That would kind of alter the balance of power within the EEC. He says if England asks in turn to enter, but on her own conditions, this poses without doubt to each of the 6 states and poses to England problems of a very great dimension. England, in effect, is insular. She is maritime. She is linked through her exchanges, her markets, her supply lines to the most diverse and often the most distant countries. Of course, France also had an empire in very distant places. She pursues essentially industrial and commercial activities and only slight agricultural ones, so here's a nod to the cap. She has, in all her doings, very marked and very original habits and traditions. Here we have the first veto, the first time a member state decides to veto another country joining the EEC, or the European Union as it is today. So the general's will, but not necessarily the will of the general, but not necessarily the general will. So de Gaulle's veto was a unilateral veto. He didn't consult Adenauer. He didn't consult the Italians or the Dutch or the Benelux or the other Benelux. It was like, I have a veto and I'm going to impose it. Of course, Paul-Henri Spaak, the Belgian foreign minister, calls it Black Monday of European history, Black Monday of European integration. Will the European community be able to survive this shock, right? So there's a lot of people who are pretty peeved off within the EEC that de Gaulle has done this. He is legally entitled to under the treaty, but nevertheless, there was, he brings everything to a halt. And that's the end of Britain's first application to join the EEC. The British application is withdrawn from the Council consideration. So if at first you don't succeed, try again, okay? And it's interesting when you look at some of the diplomatic cables after the first veto in Dublin or in London or in Brussels or in Washington. There's a kind of a growing perception or kind of a growing consensus that, listen, Britain will join in the future, sometime in the future. We don't know when, but probably after de Gaulle either dies or resigns, or retires, I should say, right? He's not a young guy, okay? So, he's got a certain, there's a certain time span for him left in office. Of course, he runs for re-election in 1965 and wins, so of course that keeps him in power for another 7 years, presumably. So there's a growing kind of consensus that, he will die, or he will retire, and then that'll pave the way. Because there's no other European leader who is so antagonistic, right? Adenauer is quite open, and Adenauer's successors are quite open, as chancellors of Germany, quite open to the idea of enlargement. The Dutch, of course, can't wait for the British to join, largely because they're getting tired of de Gaulle. And the sheer levels of spending on a common agricultural policy is becoming a bit silly as well. But nevertheless, new government, new application. Harold Wilson, the leader of the Labour Party, comes to power in the mid-1960s with a very slim majority in 64. Not enough of a majority to make a big, bold foreign policy decision. So there's another election a couple of years later, strengthens his majority. In 1966, of course, we have the famous empty chair crisis in the European Union. The French literally empty chair. They leave the Council of Ministers for 6 months. The latter half of 1965, 1966, we have an agreement called Luxembourg Compromise, and then that agreement is signed in Luxembourg in early 1966. Community business resumes, and after the spring of '66, there is a growing, the rumor mill starts again that maybe Britain will seek to join the EEC, but for different reasons this time. Perhaps you could say the first British application in '61 was political, the wind of change, and responding to the wind of change. The second application largely is grounded on economics. Britain has got problems. Balance of payments problems, sterling problems, wide economic issues that perhaps membership of the EEC will be a solution to those problems. So the Labour government decides to take up where the Conservatives left off in '63. And Harold Wilson makes an application in May 1967. The application was made, I think, on the 10th or the 11th of May 1967. And very quickly de Gaulle comes out. De Gaulle is not going to allow another 18 months of negotiations just to pull the plug again, right? He has to be more strategic this time. I will make it clear that I don't want them in, without issuing a veto, I will make it clear my opposition. And even when you look at some of the diplomatic cables, the Irish embassy in The Hague, in January of '67, so 5 months before this application, the Irish diplomats abroad are writing to Dublin and saying, you know, because of course they have a strategic interest in knowing whether or not London's going to move towards the EEC. And they're like, you know, the antagonism towards Britain in Paris hasn't changed. So Britain might be moving towards this, but nothing's going to change. We don't see them actually joining, right? So notwithstanding the fact that it's clear to most that, you know, this is not going to be successful, Harold Wilson nevertheless moves towards an application. And there's a lot of, in the scholarly literature, there's still a debate as to why he does this. His party is massively divided on the Europe question. Many don't want to join the EEC. Does he do this knowing he's not going to be successful? And he's simply setting up the groundwork for later on when it will be. Nevertheless, de Gaulle comes out and says on the 16th of May that the British economy would destabilise the EEC. If Britain came in now, there would be problems. The position of sterling as an international reserve currency would have a negative impact on the florin, the lira, the Deutschmark, and the various francs. So it would destabilise the currencies of the 6 member states. So de Gaulle comes out and he says what he has to say, short of saying no, right? So it's a veto of sorts. They call it the velvet veto. So, but things progress. I mean, there are still the member states ask the European Commission for their opinion, which they're obliged to do. They ask the Commission, well, can we have a written opinion on the British application, second British application? Kind of an overview and objective analysis of the impact that Britain would have as a member. So the Commission goes away and does her work for the summer of 1967. And the Commission comes out with a relatively positive assessment of the impact Britain would have, but there is a section in the document that says we have reservations on the state of the British economy. So de Gaulle jumps on this. He doesn't really need any more ammunition because Britain devalues the pound sterling in the 3rd week of November 1967. De Gaulle comes out at the end of November and says, well, I told you so. I told you their economy was not strong enough. And there's a growing perception then within the member states of the EEC, de Gaulle's partners, that, okay, yeah, they're not... There are economic problems that Britain may need to deal with first before they join. So he kind of repeats his veto and makes it quite clear the second time that Britain will not be entering at the moment. There's a Council of Ministers meeting in December '67 where basically they decide, okay, the application is on the table, we will leave it there. There's going to be no activity, but we will not, the application is not withdrawn. The second British application remains active in kind of an inactive way on the council table. And simply then, a couple of years later, it's reactivated rather than a new application. So some people might say, yeah, Britain tried to join 3 times, or maybe twice, but it's kind of, you know, an academic exercise. But nevertheless, the application is not withdrawn like it was in '63. It is simply, it remains on the council agenda, but it's largely inactive. Things change pretty rapidly then. In France, at least, we have, of course, the '68 revolts that start here in the United States at the University of California at Berkeley. Education, I think, was the main issue that started it off, and of course it very quickly expands to become a protest about probably everything and anything, and largely centralized on Vietnam and other conflicts and peace movements, all this kind of thing. You know, 1968 is a really phenomenal year in Europe and also, of course, in the United States and further afield, and also impacts the French, right? You have huge student protests, a lot of protests where the students joined the labour organisations in France during '68, and there is a real sense that the Fifth Republic could collapse, right? De Gaulle sacks his government in mid-68. Georges Pompidou, who was Prime Minister, is replaced by his long-serving Foreign Minister, Maurice Coulter-Merville. And de Gaulle's party are as popular as ever after the protests. It's almost as if de Gaulle has strengthened his hand after national elections in 68. Then in April, March-April 1969, de Gaulle holds this constitutional change. Very minor, very insignificant. It's kind of a referendum on changes to the Senate, government issues. He loses it. He loses the referendum. Now, it's a setback, but de Gaulle takes all of these things so personally, right? And he sees it as a rejection of him. He resigns as President of France. And shortly thereafter, he boards a military plane and flies to the one country for kind of a self-imposed exile for a few weeks, the one country that he felt would not give the wrong political impression. He wanted to go to Britain, but given that he's kept him out of the EEC for so long, he thought maybe I won't go to Britain for a self-imposed exile. So he flies to the southwest of Ireland and spends about 6 to 7 weeks walking the beaches of Geary, writing his memoirs, while France decides who will succeed him. Some fantastic pictures in the archives of this towering figure walking the windswept beaches and with the Atlantic in the background. And he's like his aide-de-camp, his security guard at a distance behind, and spends a number of weeks there writing his memoirs. And there's even a book on de Gaulle and Ireland for those 6 weeks, of course. So, and of course, he as the Irish often reminded him during their bilateral meetings during the 60s when they kept begging to join the EEC, that the Irish kept reminding de Gaulle that, of course, he is part Irish, having ancestors from the northwest of the country. So, the presidential elections produce an unexpected outcome. Georges Pompidou, who was part, of course, of de Gaulle's party, he had been a long-serving prime minister, becomes president of France, succeeds de Gaulle. Pompidou is not as rigid. He's not as anti-Britain. He's not as anti-enlargement as de Gaulle had been. But nevertheless, he's also part of the Gaullist party. He's relying on the same Gaullist voters as de Gaulle did when he was running for election. And his party's support base is largely agricultural. So, but he's a bit more flexible on the issue of enlargement. The British then reactivate their application to join the EEC in 1970. There's a growing perception, okay, the current environment now is a little better. It's it's more congenial. Things have changed. De Gaulle is gone, and there's there's more of an openness to pursue the issue of enlargement and to make it work. You also have a new government. On the eve of the enlargement negotiations opening in the middle of 1970, the Conservatives win power over Labour. Edward Heath becomes Prime Minister. His Education Secretary is Margaret Thatcher, the first and only cabinet position she ever holds before she becomes Prime Minister herself in 1979. But nevertheless, that government, with Margaret Thatcher, largely embraced the issue of negotiations. Ted Heath, of course, is the most, forceful proponent of accession. Probably the most pro-European of any Prime Minister before or after him. He embarks on this, 2-year, a year and a half of negotiations with member states, with the 6 member states. The biggest issue is the budget. How much will Britain pay into the annual EEC budget? This is a big problem. And because of Britain's size, there's an expectation, particularly from the French, that they should pay a high price, right? the British, so there's kind of a clash of ideologies here. Britain is like, well, we don't get very much out of the budget, so we think we should pay maybe 2 or 3% at the first year into the budget. The French are like, well, we think you should pay at least 20% of the annual budget every year. So there's a major problem there. The European Commission also sides with the French in thinking that no, the British should pay at least 18-19% of the overall budget as their contribution. Heath wants to join the EEC, right? He wants to join. He has a meeting with Pompidou in '71, a bilateral meeting in Paris, where it's a political meeting on negotiations, where the negotiations had kind of gotten bogged down on the issue of figures of money and how much they would pay. De Gaulle or Pompidou and Heath, kind of that political meeting, bilateral meeting, kind of solves some of those problems. Heath wants to get in. He doesn't want to have to bargain, and have to this unseemly business of discussing money. So Britain then pays a relatively high opening amount annually as part of their contribution. Now, this probably is the original sin, okay? Because when Thatcher becomes Prime Minister, of course, the big issue she has is the sheer volume that the British are paying into the annual budget, where 70 to 80% of the overall EU budget in the 1970s is being spent on agriculture, of the total budget. And the remaining 20% is being spent on all the other policy areas. And at the same time, the member states are saying, we want this policy, we want that policy. And Margaret Thatcher says in 1980, well, okay, if you want new policies, reform the cap. Spend less on the cap and use that money to develop new policy areas. Because we're not paying any more in for new areas unless you actually reform the cap. So the budgetary issue became quite problematic during the negotiations, but of course then dominated the first 5 years for premiership at a European level from 79 to 84. Britain gets in 1973. There had been expectations that Britain would form a counterbalance to the French. The Dutch were very excited. They were hoping that there would be kind of a new sphere of influence. 1973 is an interesting year in world politics because we have the first oil crisis. The Arab-Israeli war. The price of oil quadruples. The Dutch, of course, support the Israelis. And you have the port in Rotterdam blockaded. So we have increasing inflation, increasing unemployment, major problems in the European Union. But nevertheless, one of the positives actually is Britain joins. At least this is what should have been a moment of excitement. But very quickly then pursues very erratic policies. And after the break, I will discuss those erratic policies. Thank you.
Good to go.
Great. Okay, so by 1973, Britain after a decade or more of trying to get into the European Community, signs the Treaty of Accession on the 22nd of January 1972. On the 1st of January 1973, becomes an official member of the European Community. So it's the first successful enlargement. Unfortunately, immediately after the first enlargement, 1974, you have an election in Britain. Harold Wilson, the previous Prime Minister, is still leader of the Labour Party, and he runs an election campaign on the promise of renegotiating the deal Heath has hammered out in Brussels. So almost immediately post-membership, Britain is pursuing erratic electoral politics on the Europe question, and this does not go down well with their European partners. The idea was that Britain and the first enlargement would be a cause for euphoria and excitement, and after a decade we have succeeded in expanding our borders. Many in Europe are saying, Britain would be a valued player, a valued partner. They won't be crazy and they won't do all of these things. They won't be disruptive. They won't try to get in to break it apart from the inside. Many were saying almost immediately afterwards, well, we told you so. And in many ways, Franco-German hegemony remains the same. There's no shifting of balances of power within the European community. France still plays a very, very strategic role. Britain is somewhat marginalised, largely because of their lack of interest in a lot that's going on in the European Union. And as Desmond Dinan talks about in one of his books on the European Union, Britain does pursue relatively erratic European policies in the post-accession period. It doesn't, that doesn't kind of, make their European partners love them any more, somewhat less indeed. So, the British join. On the coattails, or the apron, the coattails of the British application, you have the Irish, the Danes, and the Norwegians. I will go relatively quickly through these, largely because, not because they're not important, and of course being Irish, I think the Irish decision to enter the European Union in 1973 was perhaps the most important singular event in the history of Ireland in the 20th century after independence, only comparable with independence from Britain in the 1920s. This is for sure the biggest foreign policy decision the Irish government, any Irish government, has made since leaving the British Empire in the early 1920s. And for the Irish, it is a simple case. Do we want to remain on the apron strings of Britain, or should we attach ourselves to the purse strings of Europe? So, on more of the intellectual debates you see on Ireland and the EEC, Ireland is looking for less dependence on Britain and more interdependence with Europe. There are many countries with a big neighbour. Small countries with a big neighbour, a big shadow, okay? Central and Eastern Europe, also then the Irish example is the same. The majority of Irish trade goes to Britain, even 30 or 40 years after independence. That's unsustainable if Britain joins the EEC without Ireland. Similar problem to the British colonies. So Ireland then, Ireland officially, technically, is the first country ever to apply for membership of the EEC by a matter of days. Okay, the Irish apply for membership on the 31st of July 1961. A day later, the British apply to join. I mean, it's a silly fact of history, but nevertheless probably an important, minor but important one. So the Irish are attracted to Europe largely for the agricultural subsidies. The common agricultural policy is a big thing. Ireland doesn't have the same emotional affinity with the continent, notwithstanding centuries earlier the Irish went out and helped to Christianise most of Europe. Monks and whatnot went off on their little boats spreading the good word that St. Patrick was espousing in Ireland. But nevertheless, Ireland was not involved in the Second World War, not to the same extent that the Continentals were. Ireland had a policy of neutrality, well, selective neutrality. At the very, very top corner of the Irish coastline, you would see rocks with rocks in the shape of the word ERA, Ireland. So when American pilots were flying over, they would know they have reached Europe because they see, oh, we are in Ireland, don't bomb us. So Ireland was kind of quasi-neutral in the Second World War. But nevertheless, their post-war European policy was very much centred on maintaining trade relations with Britain. And then in the 1950s, they were paying close attention to what was happening on the continent in terms of the creation of the EEC, the Treaty of Rome, and the European Free Trade Area. Ireland was not part of the original EEC, nor was Ireland invited to join the EFTA. So Ireland was excluded from all of the economic blocs at the beginning of 1960s. Throughout the 1960s, Ireland embarks on this massive policy of industrialisation. Sean Lemass, the Irish Taoiseach, or the Irish Prime Minister, spends the first part of the 1960s going from one Chamber of Commerce meeting to another Chamber of Commerce meeting and a whole host of turkey dinners later, espousing, selling the benefits of EU membership. Now, he didn't know when we were going to join, but he kept telling these people, these manufacturers, these industries, these industrial councils, we're going to join sooner or later. You've got to use the time now to wean yourself off state aid. Because when you join the EEC, you know, you're on your own, okay? Because of EEC competition law and whatnot. So he used the time very wisely to prepare industry for the brunt of wider economic competition, market competition. And that decade, the decade of failure, the failure to join during the 1960s, that policy of failure actually becomes, on mature reflection, almost policy of success, because had Ireland joined in 1961, it would have been an awful lot worse. So we had a decade to prepare and a decade to get industry thinking on a wider canvas rather than on the narrow canvas of Anglo-Irish trade, which had dominated. So funding, agricultural funding and cohesion funding were major economic incentives to join the EEC. So for the British, arguably it was the politics of membership. Politics was a central element, getting in and trying to maybe gain some leadership. For the Irish, it was largely, I think, the question of the economics of membership, what economic benefits Ireland would gain. The first application was made, as I said, in July 61. Negotiations with the British opened. They did not open with Ireland. I think the overriding concern amongst the French and the European Commission was, let's just start negotiations with Britain. Let's not have 3 or 4 different negotiations ongoing at the same time. Let's do one at a time. Of course, that infuriated the Irish, but nevertheless, that was the way it was. At the very, very end of 1962, you do see negotiations open, but of course then de Gaulle vetoes the British application. De Gaulle, or during the first application in 61, 2 key issues that dominate the Irish application is first Irish suitability for membership. Is Ireland really a candidate for full membership, as opposed to the lesser option or alternative of associate membership? And Ireland is neutral and not a member of NATO. But there was many in the community that believed that the EEC was not a neutral organisation. It was a political organisation. All EEC member states were NATO members as well. So there's an ongoing debate about whether Ireland should be excluded because of its NATO status, non-NATO membership, and its neutrality. Throughout the course of the early 1960s, Irish leaders went so far to say, well, yeah, of course we're neutral, but, you know, we do believe in, of course, you know, defence and these kinds of issues. So, you know, they went very far to kind of explicitly say, well, listen, if we have to join NATO to get into the EEC, we won't rule it out, okay? And the Dutch Commissioner for Agriculture, Sikko Mansholt, came to Dublin during the early 1960s and said to them, well, if NATO was a stumbling block to your getting into the EEC, would you consider joining it? Because there is a number of people in Brussels saying, well, it's a problem for us. And the Irish government are like, well, actually, yeah, we don't really have a policy of neutrality. It's kind of like, you know, an Anglo-Irish thing. Well, we adopted neutrality because the British went off to war. Anyway, so de Gaulle says no to Britain in January 63, and then, of course, by default, the Irish application is also dead. The Irish will not join the EEC without Britain. It doesn't make any economic sense. So their application also goes by the wayside. 1967, much like the British application, the Irish apply again for membership. The Gaul's no means the Irish again, their application remains on the council table. It's not withdrawn, but it's going to go nowhere. Again, moving into the 1970s then, once the British again reapply or reactivate their application, the Irish do the same thing. The big problem for the British, of course, was the budgetary issue, as I mentioned. The big problem for the Irish was fish. The fisheries policy. The European community had just, on the eve of the negotiations in 1970, internally, the EEC had created this common fisheries policy, which meant member states could fish in the fishing waters of all their member states. That's fine. But if those four countries, the British, the Irish, the Danes, and the Norwegians, of course they were also applying for membership, if those countries joined the community and the enlarged community of 10, 60% of the entire fishing water of this wider community would be from the four new countries. So it's a win-win for the older countries, right? So fisheries becomes a major issue. The French, big fishing fleets, can come into the Irish water, take as much as they want, and then what does the Irish fishermen do? They have got smaller fleets, it's mainly inshore fishing, not out in the sea, and they can't compete. It becomes a major, major issue, and they're looking for kind of negotiations and there's deals and there's, looking at their various stretches of waters. It all becomes very complicated. That was kind of the issue. One of the stumbling blocks was, in the 1970s, conservation, environmental issues, not really very popular anywhere in the world by the 1970s. The fisheries policy was no different. There was no conservation measures, right? You could fish as much as you wanted because there was plenty of fish in the sea, right? But fishing trawlers got bigger, net sizes got smaller, so they were catching more. Conservation, environmental issues, not really a major issue. That becomes far more important and problematic when the Spaniards join in the 80s, because they are notorious for overfishing, right? So there was, and I'll get to this in a moment, so the Irish really put a lot of pressure on the community to put together more of a comprehensive policy that took into consideration preservation and net sizes and quotas. Introducing a quota was majorly like revolutionary for the European community. The Irish went to vote in May 1972. The British had no vote, of course. There was an act of parliament which decided on their membership. 1.2 million people voted and just over 1 million said yes. It was a ringing endorsement of joining the EEC. And here we are with the Irish Prime Minister and the Irish Foreign Minister signing the accession treaty in 1972, and they formally become a full member in 1973. Denmark then follows a largely similar route to the Irish and the British. They approached the Europe question largely through a trade lens. Britain was one of their main trading partners, so ergo if Britain joined the EEC, they would have to kind of follow suit. Not because of any strategic love or interest in the European project, but it was largely dictated to by trade. So, Britain joining also then followed that the Danes would have to do the same. And again, similar process, an application in 61, an application in 67, negotiations in 1970, and they also join in 1973. So that those three countries joined. For the Norwegians, it's much more complicated. They play a harder negotiating game. There's probably a sense of inevitability about the other three countries, but the Norwegians are like, well, the fisheries policy is a big problem for us because we've so much fishing. We don't want to share, right? So can we have a special agreement where you don't come into our waters? Or you don't come into our waters for at least 20 years after membership. So we have a transition period of 20 years or something bizarre. They wanted a special treatment on the issue of the common fisheries policy during the negotiations. They then come to an agreement. They come to an agreement on negotiating membership. But then the Norwegians the government puts it to a vote, and Norwegians reject it. They reject membership, and they've rejected membership a couple of times since 1970s. They've gotten to kind of the altar, and they have said no a couple of times. So Norway remains outside. 53% of the electorate said no. Ironically then, a couple of weeks later, the Danes went to the polls. So there was kind of worry that the Danes would be influenced by the Norwegian vote, but they weren't. The Danes also overwhelmingly, at least the majority of the Danes said yes to membership. 63% voted yes of a turnout with 91%, which is 90%, which is a very respectable turnout. So the first enlargement comes to an end. Relatively successful. 3 out of the 4 countries get in. Norwegians don't join because of various policy issues that they can't reconcile with their electorate. And yeah, so that should have been a period of euphoria, but it wasn't, largely because the 1970s is considered by many political scientists, at least, as a dark period of European integration history. We have the oil shock of 1973, when the Arab-Israeli War. Then by 1979, just as things are coming to kind of some normality in Europe, we have the fall of the Shah of Iran and the second oil crisis, where again oil prices rise. So you've got the 1970s are relatively challenging decades, a challenging decade for the EEC. Economic growth slows down as a result of international events in comparison to the boom years of the 1970s. So just when these 3 countries joined, thinking yes, we're in, and we're going to benefit from all of this success, while the world faces major oil crises, and the euphoria is very, very, very short-lived. Notwithstanding that, the European Union still embarks on the process of enlargement. We tend to forget, because many people, I think, consider history to be yesterday. People have a very short memory, because we live in a 24-hour news cycle, and we don't tend to reflect as often or as much as we should in general. But we tend to forget that Spain, Greece and Portugal were dominated by junta and dictatorships until relatively recently, until the mid-1970s. With the death of Franco and the removal of Salazar and the removal of the military junta, Spain, Portugal and Greece then move closer towards EEC membership. It becomes a political aspiration and a political goal. The Spaniards are actually very, very clever. I'll get to those in a minute. Much cleverer than many of the other member states who've joined in terms of their negotiating prowess. But the Greeks were the first. The Greek application was made in the mid-1970s, and I suppose it was probably the fastest in terms of application and accession. They were a member of the EEC by 1981. The European Commission, in its opinion, it's a V on to the European Council, so the European Commission writes their opinion, it sends it to the Council, and their opinion is whether or not we think what are the obstacles to Greek membership. The European Commission was relatively skeptical. They're like, yeah, well, we think Greece should join the EEC, for sure, as a way to stabilise their democracy and stabilise the country in the post-junta period. But not yet. Their economy is exceptionally weak. It will need more time. So we need a longer transition period before they get full membership. But the political decision to bring them in was largely taken because of the issue of stabilisation. We have to bring them in soon because there is a fear of fallback. So membership will provide more stabilisation quicker. And it was largely a political decision, a Franco-German political decision, to bring Greece in quicker and then deal with any problems after membership. Now, Greece has been operating a budget deficit since around the 12th century AD. They've been, relatively underdeveloped for a very, very long time. They needed a lot of European EEC investment. And again, in terms of cultural variations, it has taken a long time to reconcile this within the EEC and indeed in its successor, the European Union. So the reason for fast-tracking Greek membership was largely for political stabilization and pumping enough money in to help the economy and to help, and by default then improving political stability. So the Greek membership, the Greek application, much quicker than the Irish, Danes, and the first one. Certainly very quick. And I think perhaps we today, when we look at the Eastern European enlargements, Central Eastern European enlargements, they had criteria. There was no criteria in place for Greece. It was like, you know, you have to meet certain criteria or certain chapters, enlargement chapters, and there's a whole book of rules you must follow and things to implement before you join. That wasn't there. Unfortunately, we had really no enlargement policy, a concrete one, until the 1990s. So a lot of the problems that Greece is facing today may have been dealt with had we had more credible enlargement policy in the 1970s. So again, largely for a security political decision to bring Greece in. The European Commission was kind of lukewarm towards bringing them in, but nevertheless, it was considered, there was a wider political consideration, and that the European Union kind of wanted to stabilize that whole region rather than be kind of dragged into an Aegean Cold War. So by bringing them under the umbrella of the European Community, it would foster kind of promotion of democracy, freedom of press, independent judiciary, all these kinds of things, these norms and values. And I think in many ways the European Union learned a lot from Greece, because in the 1990s, when they developed a pre-enlargement criteria policy, they looked a lot at Greece and Spain and Portugal, right? In terms of protecting norms and values, exporting norms and values, and ensuring that the member states joining would adhere and respect and buy into norms and values that the European Union is trying to export. So, for the Greeks, economic considerations were largely subordinated to political ones. Again, it was a very political accession. Then we move again a bit more west of the Mediterranean when we look at the Spanish and Portuguese accessions. Franco dies in 75. This paves the way for the restoration of the monarchy. Juan Carlos, who of course is still the king of Spain today. The restoration of the monarchy leads to this movement towards restoration of democratic institutions. Okay, so following on from the Greek accession in 1981, very quickly then the European Community also embarks on the accession negotiations for Spain and Portugal, both countries of course exiting from dictatorship in the middle of the 1970s. The transition towards democracy in Spain was very much part of, or the launch of democracy was very much linked with joining the EEC as quickly as possible, and they were determined to gain membership. And largely, it was for political reasons, to stabilise democracy. As a stabilising factor, enlargement is very important. But moreover, of course, there was also significant economic benefits to joining the EEC, notwithstanding, of course, the sheer volume of funding available for the common agricultural policy, and which would benefit many of the olive growers and the winemakers in Spain. So, there was a process that of course the Spaniards had to go through. There was the Constitution of 1978, where they made clear there was going to be a social democratic state where the rule of law was guaranteed. That checks one of the main boxes for EEC membership. Britain, of course, a big supporter. Britain has always been a big supporter. After their own membership, has been a big supporter of other countries joining, and argued that enlargement was an investment in Europe's democratic future, and were very much supportive of the Spanish and indeed subsequent enlargements. The British, Margaret Thatcher herself was a big promoter of enlargement into Central and Eastern Europe. And in July 77, they make a formal application to join what then had become, of course, the European Community. One of the problems, of course, with many of these enlargements is, yes, we want them to join. There's kind of a higher, there's a higher kind of calling, to improve democratic institutions and so on, and to boost democracy in Europe. But at the same time, of course, there's also the hard reality of a negotiation. Spain joining the EEC was going to cause problems for the other member states, particularly in the area of fisheries and agriculture. And the French in particular, the Prime Minister at the time, Jacques Chirac, who of course later became French president in the 1990s, early 2000s, talked about Spanish accession having an unbearable impact for French agriculture. And there was also talk about excluding Spain from the CAP, and so on. So there was a lot of this the politics of the negotiations, which of course were largely linked to the economic impact that it would have. Others then raised other objections. The French President Valéry Giscard also talked about some of the major impacts on agriculture, largely the impact it would have on French agriculture should they join. And there was kind of a pause period in the early 1980s. Negotiations kind of paused for a while, came to a halt. And it wasn't just the centre-left, centre-right governments in France. It was also François Mitterrand had the same objections when he became French president in the early 1980s. But nevertheless, negotiations did come to a pause for a while in 1982 until some of these major problems the French had became resolved, and they started again in 1983. And again, Spain became a member of the EEC in 1986, as did Portugal, that other country that was under dictatorship, in this case with Salazar. And for the Portuguese, of course, it's relatively interesting. They're the world's last maritime empire. In many ways, they went kicking and screaming out of empire. A very bloody end of empire in terms of their colonial holdings. We all know about Angola and Mozambique and the civil wars that emerged after those countries had gained independence. Very shocking, very bloody. Not the only ones, of course. I mean, we have the Belgian Congo and other former colonies also experienced very deadly and bloody civil wars. But in many ways, the Portuguese did not paint themselves in any glory post empire. And then, of course, after Salazar, there is a push towards extracting themselves from these colonies and moving towards more of a pluralist democracy and ergo moving towards EEC membership. So they apply for EEC membership in 1977, around the same time, of course, the Spaniards do it. There's a lot of rivalry between the Spaniards and the Portuguese in terms of negotiating positions and so on. The Spaniards are very good negotiators, largely because of their nocturnal habits. The Spaniards can stay up, they have dinner at 11 o'clock in the evening. Most of the Europeans are kind of falling asleep at that stage, but they're still negotiating. And many negotiators would tell you, that the Spaniards could stay up all night. We weren't really sure what we were negotiating away during the talks. But the Spaniards were very, very good at that. The Spanish Prime Minister at the time was constantly on the plane, constantly going around to the EEC member states, lobbying hard for Spanish membership. And really, there was a really good PR machine running very, very quickly towards the late 1970s in terms of promoting Spanish membership. And they were very, very clued into the whole process very, very quickly after Franco. But also very, very good negotiators, so that really is very important when you are, embarked on a very serious negotiation, one of the biggest decisions that any country will make in their foreign policy, joining the EEC, the EU. So clearly, they were more than just clued in. They were adept at negotiating, particularly on the complex issues of CAP and fisheries. So in '86, then we move towards 12 members of the European community. Fast forward then to the 1990s, next enlargement, bringing in the northern countries. And the next enlargement really has, I suppose you could make some parallels to today and the crisis we have between the Ukraine and Russia. The Scandinavian countries were largely prohibited from joining the EEC from its inception until the 1990s, until the end of the Soviet Union. Finland, Austria, Sweden were it wasn't, a direct rule from Moscow saying you cannot move any closer, but it was largely seen as these countries should not, and they should stay neutral, and they should remain as a buffer between the Soviet Union and this growing European community. Austria, of course, maintains a policy of neutrality after the war, declares of her own free will her perpetual neutrality. This was part of the constitutional article in 1955. And the same article talks about, in all future times, Austria will not join any military alliance and will not permit the establishment of any foreign military bases on its territory. So, you know, while the EEC was not military, of course, there was a certain political element to it, and it was seen as a rising political entity. Has a policy of non-alignment, and of course Russian influence is also significant in its foreign policy. In the 1990s, there are geopolitical changes, which are significant for Austria in terms of the collapse of the Soviet Union means that Austria is no longer hamstrung in how it moves and deals with its foreign policy. And the only part of the original constitutional requirements that are still there is this issue of not having any foreign military bases in Austria. That's probably the last remaining element of its post-war neutrality element. They have gotten involved in an awful lot of peacekeeping missions within the European Union and so on, but they have moved beyond the shadow of the Soviet Union. Finland, again, moving towards the European Union is a major turning point in Finnish history. Notwithstanding, of course, the rise of Euroscepticism in Finland today, this has been kind of a long wait-and-see process during the Cold War, where certain member states, because of their geopolitical positioning, were not allowed to move towards the European community. And then they very rapidly did so immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union, largely influenced by the Swedish decision in 1991. We will get to the Swedes in a moment, but the Swedes had problems with their economy. They moved towards the European Union, and that's a bit of a shock to the Finns. The Finns were like, whoa, we didn't see this coming. And then very quickly after the Swedes had moved towards Europe, the Finns did something similar. So there was an imperative, I should say, to join the EEC that became rather increased once the Swedes moved. Because, of course, you've got trade relations, you've got diplomatic relations, and then, you know, having one country, one of your closest partners inside and you remaining on the outside, this becomes a major problem, domestic problem. So it's not because they wanted to join or they felt an affinity towards the European project. It largely comes down to either economic or political reasons. They don't really buy into the idea of an ever closer union or United States of Europe. They largely believe in this, you know, this geopolitical, it makes geopolitical sense to do this. The Maastricht Treaty, of course, changes an awful lot then. The Maastricht Treaty was signed in and around the same time that these three countries, or these countries, Finland, Austria and Sweden, were joining the EEC, and we'll get to that in a moment. So Austria and Finland and Sweden, another country with a traditional policy of non-alignment, in order to maintain its ability to play its international role. And you see sometimes, I think, what's good about the European Union in that we don't have a foreign policy is that you do hear so many different competing voices around the council table on foreign policy issues. You have somewhat of the predictable lines of the NATO members of the European Council, you've got the non-aligned countries, the neutral countries, and you've an interesting mix of discussion and debate and perspectives, which I think sometimes can help our international partners in getting a better understanding of military intervention or of aid assistance and these kinds of things. So Sweden, another country that moves towards closer to the EEC after the collapse of the Soviet Union. These three countries, Austria, Finland, Sweden, have been part of other international organizations in the post-war period, but not something as political as the EEC. They were a founding member of the OEC, the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, a founding member of the Council of Europe in the post-war period, but they didn't like integration, and they didn't like and don't like supranational institutions. When they joined in 1995 with the other two countries, before they joined, they were like, yeah, of course we will join the single currency. Yeah, no problem. Which they were legally obliged to do with the Maastricht Treaty. Any country that joined after 1992 has to join the single currency. Sweden joins in 1995, 1996 they're saying, yeah, no, we're not going to join. You know, we want to keep our currency. And public opinion is against it, and basically we probably will never join the single currency. So there was a backtrack. Why? We've no post-enlargement policy, that says you can't do this. You've promised, you must do this. You joined a club, you must stick to the rules. Problem is, there's fallback. Countries join, and they're all treated differently, right? That's one of the natures of the beast that we have created. The European community had increased its importance. It was seen as an important trading bloc, political bloc, quasi-political bloc to be part of. Sweden is a founding member of the European Free Trade Association, kind of meaningless at this stage. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, then there's a shift towards, and membership is seen as an economic imperative, largely because Sweden is facing financial economic problems in the late 80s, early 90s. And 1st of July 1991, they apply to join the EEC. All three countries become full members in 1995. That really brings us then to 15 member states, and there's a pause from 1995 for enlargement. So we finish, Western Europe, Southern Europe, Northern Europe. Of course, the elephant in the room is Eastern Europe. And almost immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you have letters of application coming in from these former satellite countries. Almost immediately. Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic. The list is endless. There's a lot of them. The European Union then embarks upon this dizzying process of treaty reform. And that's another lecture in itself, okay? But we go from the Treaty of Rome, and as nothing happens in terms of the treaty framework until 1986 with the Single European Act. Single European Act is kind of a mechanism, a timetable to complete the single market. No one thinks in 86 that the Soviet Union is going to collapse. No one thinks the Cold War will collapse or end. The Berlin Wall is a permanent fixture of European life, of world existence, right? All of these things happen very quickly. When the Maastricht Treaty is being negotiated, or when they talk about more treaty reform in the early 1990s, which is linked to the Single European Act, so the Single European Act is the timetable to complete the single market by 1992. All of this is in isolation to the global events that happen in between this period. So the Berlin Wall collapses, German reunification. That's also an enlargement because Eastern Europe joins Western Europe. It's an enlargement in itself. Collapse of the Soviet Union. This follows on requests for membership to join the EEC. Then the Europeans embark on this very dizzying process of treaty reform. We have, how can we absorb all of these countries? How can the European Union respond? How can we stay afloat by absorbing all of these countries, right? Because, as the title of my lecture talks about, EU enlargement, integration or disintegration. Can we get too big and collapse, right? So we need to have the right framework in place to absorb these countries. Policy framework, legislative framework, and so on. Institutional framework. What follows then is a process of treaty reform. The Amsterdam Treaty 98, the Nice Treaty 91, the Constitutional Treaty that starts in 2003, which collapses, of course, a couple of years later, but nevertheless, there is a process in place to try and accommodate these new member states that will eventually join. On top of this, then, you have what is very important, the Copenhagen criteria. Copenhagen criteria is a policy document, a set of policy fields that each member state, each applicant, each country that wants to join the European Union needs to be able to, has to apply all this criteria pre-membership. So really, from 1993 onwards, excluding this enlargement, from 93 onwards, it's very, very difficult. There's an awful lot more bars that you got to jump over to join the EEC. All these new chapters of policy and implementation, and it goes beyond simply having a democracy, right? It goes well beyond that. So the Copenhagen criteria is the European Union's toolkit that they apply, that they give to the applicant countries, and they need to make sure that they have that they implement all of this prior to accession. If they haven't applied it, they don't get in. That's pretty much it. The Maastricht Treaty then is one of the most important treaties in the European Union's history. I know you've already had talks on the subject, so I won't go into too much detail. Basically, the Maastricht Treaty gave us the new name, the European Union. This European thing became the European Union. So we went from EEC to EC to EU by 1992. It also gave us a single currency. So the Maastricht Treaty is really important. Then we have Amsterdam, as I said, in 1998, Nice in 2001, Constitutional Treaty in 2005, which of course died. And then you have the Lisbon Treaty of 2009, which is the current treaty functioning of the European Union. So in the early from the early to early 1990s onwards, you have this process of enlargement where 8 Central and Eastern European countries, as well as Cyprus and Malta, are seeking membership, and the negotiations go on for about a decade until they join in 2004 in what many have referred to as the Big Bang enlargement. Many, of course, will argue that, well, we brought them in too quickly, that these 10 countries came in too quickly, that there should have been a longer transition period before they came in. One of the problems, of course, is that one of the potential problems is the Free Movement Directive. So you're bringing in all of these Central and Eastern European countries, about 160 million people in these countries, and they have the right to work and live in any of the countries within the European Union after the transition period ended in 2009. This was phenomenal, and this was a very healthy process for the European Union to bring in these Central and Eastern European countries. And I know in Ireland, for example, a country that largely exports its people. Here we have a situation where we've got so many Central Eastern Europeans, predominantly Polish and Hungarians and Czechs, coming to Ireland, where about a tenth of the population is Polish in a very short period of time, where the second most spoken language in Ireland is Polish in a very, very quick period of time. That's phenomenal, massive social change for a country, as I said, that usually sends people abroad throughout our history. And here we have a massive influx of 200,000 Polish people. Really phenomenal and really healthy in kind of mixing up society and opening up society to other countries. So the 2004 enlargement has had a massive impact. Institutionally, economically, you have seen a huge amount of EU funding go in that direction. Very quickly then afterwards, we have Romania and Bulgaria. And Romania and Bulgarian enlargement, many will, even more people will say, that was too quick. And now you see a lot of problems, particularly in Britain and other countries, arguing that, well, we shouldn't allow Bulgarians and Romanians to work, allow them work permits because of the impact it has on domestic labour and so on. Last year, of course, we have Croatia becoming the 28th member of the European Union. Too many too soon? I don't know. I think it has been a relatively healthy process. With a lot of teething problems, and it's very hard to create the right framework, as you've seen here. All of these treaties that they embarked on to create the right institutional framework, to create the perfect balance to bring these countries in. And of course, you're never going to get it perfectly right. Today, as I mentioned, you have the European Union signing an agreement with the Ukraine. The European Union is moving further and further to the east. There's a lot of countries showing interest in joining. The Western Balkans is also on the Western Balkans have the European Union on their radar as well. Turkey has been an issue, and it's a constant issue, constant question I get when I lecture on the issue of enlargement or European integration. Well, will Turkey join? And my usual answer is yes, they will. I just don't know when. Turkey has been knocking on the door for a long time. Negotiations have been going on for a long time. They stop and they start. The Prime Minister of Turkey, Erdogan, just yesterday banned Twitter in his country, in Turkey. That's not going to endear Turkey to EU membership. It's not going to speed up the process. That really is something you would expect from someone like Vladimir Putin, or maybe in China, but not in a country that is selling themselves as an open democracy, at least on paper. So the European Union is embarking upon applying the Copenhagen criteria. There's about 30-something different chapters of negotiations that have to be concluded. We're slowly but surely getting through those chapters, and then it will come down to a political decision. Turkey will have a huge impact on the institutional balance, on the voting patterns in the institutions. It will be, in a very short period of time, the biggest member state by population size. That will alter the geopolitical balance and shift it away from the Franco-German relationship, presumably. Although the Franco-German relationship has proved quite resilient, notwithstanding 22 other countries joining the process, we still look towards the French and German position on a great many issues. So, will Turkey join? I say yes. I just don't know when. And I think the Irish presidency of the European Union last year worked to reopen negotiations or restart negotiations with Turkey. But we have a lot of issues. There's a lot of ongoing issues in Turkey in terms of freedom of press, freedom of the judiciary, very basic concepts and norms and values that the European Union holds very dear to itself, and that Turkey is largely not respecting in domestically. So the Twitter issue is going to reverberate massively, and again it could easily be used, that and other examples, as excuses for the European Union to say, actually no, like, we're just not going to let you in. And again, every member state of the European Union, all 28 member states, exercise a veto on enlargement. Last spring, 2013, Kosovo and Serbia signed an agreement, a very important agreement to normalise relations between the two countries. This is a criteria for Serbia to join the European Union. We have a history of, in EU enlargement, we bring in countries with conflict, attached to them, and we try and solve the conflict afterwards. Northern Ireland is a typical example. I have often argued that Ireland and Britain should not have been allowed to join the EEC until they dealt with Northern Ireland. There was already bloodshed on the streets of Derry and of Belfast before 1973. The European Union should have said, listen, you can join, but you got to sort the province out first. And that should have been kind of a carrot and stick approach. We're doing this now with Kosovo and Serbia. So we have to learn from the lessons that from the problems that we've inherited with various enlargements. Kosovo and Serbia need to deal with their bilateral relationship before they join the EEC. Because the last thing we want is for Serbia to join the EU and then veto possible Kosovo membership. Scotland, of course, will have a referendum on independence on the 18th of September of 2014. And independent Scotland will have to make an application to join the EU.
Do you think they will?
Yeah, whether I think they will go independent, of course, remains to be seen. I personally would like Scotland to go independent. I think that's an Irish prejudice. And maybe sure, why not let the Welsh go as well? And then, so I don't know. Nevertheless, we will be looking at another enlargement. So in many ways, in the 18th to 19th century, Europe became defined by maps. Okay, this is the map of Europe, and ergo we are civilized now. But the European map has been changing, and it will continue to change. We have seen it in the last number of weeks with Crimea. Crimea now is part of the Russian Federation, so we need to change the maps of Europe again. If Scotland goes independent, again, we'll have to change the maps of Europe to reflect that. But again, they will have to join the European Union. They have to make a separate application for accession. Catalonia in Spain, again, has promised to hold a referendum on membership. A referendum on independence later this year, after the Scottish vote. Madrid has said it would be illegal. But again, there is a lot of public support for independence, notwithstanding some of the major economic problems, of course, that, it's easy to say, yeah, we want to go independent, but there are logistics, there are, wider ramifications to independence. But then others would say, listen, it doesn't matter about borders anymore. If you're in the EU, you're in the EU, right? That's all you should worry about. Forget about the borders, because we have borders, they're just not manned anymore, except for Britain and Ireland, they're outside of Schengen. But nevertheless, you're in the EU, you've all the benefits. Why get so worried about borders and these little silly disputes? But nevertheless, people have gone to war over less. So these border issues and territorial integrity is crucial for a lot of these countries, especially Spain. They want to remain one whole. Notwithstanding again that Catalonia these regions of Spain have very interesting histories of independence and of mergers and so on. So a lot of it is complicated. On the issue of joining, you've also the issue of exiting. And David Cameron said last year that he will, as I said earlier, he hopes to, if he's re-elected next year, have a referendum on Britain's membership in 2017. So again, the Lisbon Treaty, signed into law in 2009, the treaty that is the functioning treaty of the European Union today, introduces for the first time a clause that says a country can leave the European Union. So the first EU treaty that actually mentions this. How it would work in practice, who knows, right? How do you extract yourself from all of this? The European Union and the United States are embarking on a transatlantic trade and investment partnership. Britain's part of the European Union, and ergo it's part of the deal. If Britain leaves the European Union, it's out of the transatlantic trade and investment partnership. If it wanted to get in, it would have to ask the European Union to allow them in, and it would depend on how awkward the divorce was in terms of, you know, European Union goodwill towards Britain and letting them back into the transatlantic trade and investment partnership. So an awful lot of what ifs that can't be answered, of course, until we have figures in the ballot boxes. So in conclusion, political scientists in particular love theories. How do we theorize EU enlargement? Is there one theory that explains the whole process? Is it a rational choice? You know, is it spillover? How do we explain EU enlargement and the process of integration, or the process of integration and enlargement, which is part of it? I argue, well, one size doesn't fit all. All of the member states who have joined, all of the countries who want to join, they've all approached the topic, they've all approached Europe, their geographical, their strategic interests from very different perspectives. Very few countries have ever joined, I think probably no country ever joined the European Union because they believed in the European dream, right? They wanted it for political reasons, for strategic reasons, for economic reasons, for enhanced leadership, for interdependence from their neighbours, a whole host of reasons. So it's a complex set of explanations on each enlargement. Some countries then, when they join the European Union, have opted in and opted out of certain policy areas. The Danes and the British have opted out of the single currency. The British and the Irish have opted out of the Schengen Agreement. Does that ability to kind of pick and choose kind of an a la carte menu of European integration weaken the process or strengthen it? Well, again, one size doesn't fit all. Every European country approaches issues at a different pace. And the issues are defined and they approach the issues largely from their own national perspectives and own national self-interests. We don't have a federal United States of Europe. We have got the European Union is an economic and political partnership, and one needs to approach it from that perspective. When countries join the European Union, they have a tendency to be treated differently. We look at the single currency. Greece joined the single currency through very dubious means, but again, there's no post-enlargement policy. So if you join a tennis club or a cricket club, you know, you have a rule book, you must follow the rules. If you don't follow the rules, you're kicked out. In the European Union, we have got member states who break the rules, but there's relatively little oversight. And finally then you have enlargement and the institutions. With each enlargement, especially in the early days, the European Commission increased its role substantially. The lead negotiator for each of the negotiations, the Commission negotiates as part of, negotiates for the EU. So the European Union, the institutional framework has gotten more power as a result of each expansion. And with each expansion, we also have seen an expansion of the policy framework. The more competences are being shifted towards Brussels. So the institutions have gained more. Finally then, the question I asked at the outset, does enlargement lead to integration or disintegration? I think it leads to diversity. I think it leads to a greater deal of diversity. And it's very hard to square a circle when you've got 28 competing voices around a table. And we see this in Ukraine. And Ukraine probably is a good example of where the European Union its member states have got such diverse interests that it's very hard for the Americans, for example, when they're looking at Europe, to think, okay, if we're going to impose sanctions, we need to remember that the Bulgarians have different interests in Russia, the Italians have different interests in Russia, the Poles really have different interests. How do we, put together a framework to deal with Russian aggression or kind of any international threat when you've got 28 different foreign policies? But that's what you do when you bring in these countries. You have to learn to try and find some unity within that diversity. And I will leave it there. Thank you.